from Vassar College, this is Conversations at the Salt Line with Wesley Dixon. On this episode, a conversation with Minerva Tantoko.
Hello everyone, it's me Wes, and welcome to another episode of Conversations at the Salt Line. Today, I'm excited to welcome our Sophomore Career Connections keynote for 2025, who is a multi-hyphenate, founder, technologist, angel investor, former first Chief Technology Officer for the City of New York, among many other things, Minerva Tantoko, class of 86. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here, Wes, and really thrilled to be back on campus, and it's really fun to talk with you.
Yeah, Sophomore Career Connections is one of my favorite times at Vassar because we get folks like you to come back on campus and impart wisdom and thoughts and ideas, and also learn alongside our current students who are sophomores as they navigate their career journey. And it's particularly exciting, of course, to have you here because, as I understand it, a lot of your career journey started actually at Vassar. In particular, I heard that you started your first company before you even graduated from Vassar. Can you tell me some of that story?
Yeah, absolutely. I credit Vassar and my liberal arts education with my entire career trajectory. So I got to school and I had my full plan. I was going to be a doctor. Going to major in biology. I had all the plans, lined up in a row, as you do. I'd spent a lot of years doing science. And when I got here, I got really interested in a lot of the broader courses that I was asked to take. Philosophy 101, art history. And it was an eye-opening experience. And in fact, I started to think about becoming a brain surgeon.
Okay.
And so I thought, let me take some psychology courses, cognitive psychology, neuropsychology, that's all related. But one of the courses required me to go to the computer center and use the program for statistical analysis called SPSS at the time. And so starting in 82, I started using a computer. And once my hands touched that keyboard, I never looked back.
Love it first sight.
I really thought, wow, you mean you can type into a computer and give it instructions and it can think for you? Yeah. And the relationship to studying how the brain works and how a computer would work was really very top of mind at the time. And I absolutely loved my philosophy courses. I never thought that I would love so much the ideas of the ancient Greek philosophers and then the German Romantic philosophers. And so very early on, the concept of mind-body dualism and sort of what's the brain and what's the mind and how does that all work really just got me so excited. And so what I decided to do was, okay, let me figure out how I can still go to medical school and take all these wonderful courses.
Sure.
But I was already well into it. I started taking very early programming classes, which were here. Computer science was not a major here. Cognitive science was not a major at the time. I think it started a year later. Yeah. But the fact that Vassar allowed for you to create an independent field of study really gave me permission to sort of just keep exploring my intellectual curiosity and see where it took me. Yeah. It wasn't so much about what career I could have, but much more about what was I interested in and just following my curiosity. And then during my junior year, I was visiting a former classmate who had gone to Silicon Valley to help start a company. And I was just visiting there in the summer of 85. And I met up with them. And they were starting an AI company in 1985. And I said, I know all about AI. I'm a programmer. And, so I stayed through that whole summer. I didn't come back.
Oh, my gosh.
They needed help in sort of translating what they were calling, a knowledge or expert system and teaching a computer how to do what they wanted it to do. And with even the background that I had, I was able to be basically the very first product manager. I even spent the fall semester there. Luckily, I had banked enough credits that I could still go back in the spring of '86
And do one more
and do
semester.
one more semester and get one degree,
Yeah.
and that was the philosophy degree. So it was really through my connection at Vassar that I stumbled into this very first startup.
Yeah. It's funny because, that was back in 85, 86. And I'm curious how it felt to be a founder in college, sort of at that time, full stop. And also just comparing it to what the ecosystem feels like now, right? Because so many
Right.
people now in colleges and universities are aspiring to be founders or startup leaders. And I'm just curious if that was sort of a continuous flow that always was the case from 85 up until 2025, or if there was sort of a cyclical nature of
Yeah.
that
No, that's an
experience.
excellent question. I think, part of it is at the time, no one was dropping out of college to start, except a couple people you might have heard of. Steve
Right.
Jobs, Bill Gates. Certainly not Minerva Tantoko, who was going to be a doctor. My parents were like, "You're going to do what? Like, you're staying where? What?" Like,
Right.
It wasn't done, and now, because they have become so successful, everyone wants to follow that path. But they and I were not trying to follow a path. In fact, it was against what most people thought of doing, was to not even graduate yet and start it. Now, I did come back because, especially for me, it was so important that after all that time that I'd put in, and I only had one semester left,
Sure.
I came back, wrote my senior thesis, which I recently got out of the
Revisited.
archives. You know what it was about?
Please
It
tell
was
me.
about the theory of subjectivity in machines. Can machines have a subjective point of view? Can machines have emotions? That was from 1986.
Seems kind of timely.
It wasn't timely in '86. People thought it was kind of kooky to think
Yeah.
about what a subjective point of view and a machine would be like.
Absolutely.
Does a machine have an eye? But again, who knew at the time? It just seemed crazy at the time. But
Yeah.
it was something that really interested me, and it was the ability to have all the resources here at Vassar, all
Sure.
the professors who were very supportive in exploring this new idea of thinking machines. And, that gave me the space and really the drive to sort of just pursue these lines of thought.
Incredible.
And, both both the studies I've done here and also the people I've met here
Right.
have really been a continuous thread throughout my
Absolutely.
career in the last 4 decades.
That's so cool and so inspiring. So it's funny, you of course described how you were and are a founder of sorts back in '85 and still today. And many people listening might be people, students or otherwise, who aspire to be founders of something, not necessarily tech startups. They could be founders of nonprofits or whatever, right? And so, and you've worked across industries. You've worked in government, you've worked in nonprofit in some capacities. So I'm just in the tech, of course. So I'm just curious, what are some of the key attributes from your perspective of folks who make successful founders?
Well, I think for sure this notion of like a myriad leader, someone who can really connect the dots across multiple disciplines, across multiple applications, across different ecosystems. I think the secret to innovation is the intersection of different disciplines, the intersection of different people, multidisciplinary teams. That has been my secret sauce. When I get asked, what is your superpower? I'd say I'm a dot connector.
Yeah.
I connect dots, and if there isn't a dot there, I put a dot there and then
Make one,
connect
yeah,
it.
draw
But
one.
it's sort of this idea that you can think both analytically and holistically at the same time. And this critical thinking and being able to break down complex problems into smaller ones, that's now we call it design thinking.
Sure.
But that is something that, a liberal arts education will get you.
Yeah.
It's not about spending 5 years learning how to program a specific language.
Yeah.
That, of course you
There's a
have
role
to do
for
that.
that, obviously, right?
But I think the extra advantage and superpower is what you get from a liberal arts education.
I love that. You know, it's funny. Of course, we're on a podcast called Conversations at the Salt Line. And salt lines, I don't know if you know what the term refers to, but it's a helpful analogy to what you just described, right? The sort of intersection of these multi-hyphenate disciplines or people or teams or myriad perspectives coming together to be generative, right? As opposed to something that sort of creates chaos and confusion and sort of destruction in a dramatic sense. The coming together of those things, at least in our hypothesis here, is what creates magic. And it seems like you have had that experience in your own career as well.
Absolutely. And you know, this goes back to the De Medicis, actually, the idea that you can incorporate architecture and painting and science. And, you know, Leonardo da Vinci was one of my favorite, you know, folks because he was the original multi-hyphenate dude, you know?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the titles you've had across myriad organizations, industries, has been Chief Technology Officer. To my understanding, you've had that role at UBS, at Merrill Lynch. You've had it, as we said earlier, for the City of New York, the first person to have it for the City of New York. And so we'll get into that latter experience in detail in a moment. But I'm just curious for us to level set. If you could explain generally sort of what a CTO, a Chief Technology Officer, does, and also maybe reflect on how the role has changed over time as technology, of course, has changed and how it's been used has changed.
Yeah, absolutely. Another great question because, you know, in many ways, I've invented every job I've ever had. When I graduated from college, even CIO, Chief Information Officer, wasn't a title.
Right.
There was a Manager of Information Systems, MIS. And it was, you know, literally the dude who, you know, was running the mainframes. And he
Right.
would, like, knock on the door and ask for some data or something, and they would, like, slip it on a disk to you. And so those titles didn't even exist.
Right.
I was the first CTO at Gray Advertising, at Gray Direct, in 1998. And, you know, this was after I had founded the company that I sold. And so I think it initially was a CIO. Let me clarify a little bit. Initially became the first sort of C-level, chief-level position that was related to technology.
Okay.
Prior to that, it had been pretty much a support system, right? It was like, well, okay, we have the typing pool, and now we have the mainframe and the
Right.
computers, and it was very much administrative. It
Right.
supported a lot of administrative functions.
In contrast, just to be explicit, in contrast to a strategic
That's
function
right.
of an organization, which of
That's
course
right.
it now is.
Exactly. But then over time, when we started using data to make decisions, and then computers started to become more consumerized, right? The personal computer came along, and then people started using it at home, and then people started using the computer in their daily work tasks. Then it became supporting employees and supporting your customers
Oh, I
and so
see.
forth. And once that crossed that line, then it became, oh, well, that's a strategic role in a company. So typically the CIO would be someone who supports the technology in the service of the business still, but it in recognition that it deserves a seat at the C-level, at the board level, especially with security and things like that, that became important.
And one could imagine, to your point, just riffing off what you just shared, was that the opportunities for the need for collaboration between a CTO or depending on the company and whatever it was, communications, marketing, sales,
Right.
HR is
Exactly.
critical, right? When that becomes the vehicle oftentimes for how the business is transacted, right? It can't just be sort of a support system. Rather, it needs to sort of be a collaborator with these other organizational units, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then CTO came in and around the late 90s, early 2000s with the advent of the internet. And that was because not only was it supporting existing business, but Chief Technology Officer, and I teach a course on for certification for CIOs and CTOs. The CTO became far more aligned with entirely new lines of business. which is not supporting the existing business, but, you know, going from brick and mortar to an e-commerce
Got it.
just required an entirely different, I'm not just supporting the sales floor, I'm actually creating new websites
Right.
and doing shopping carts and all of that stuff. And in advertising, it
Right.
was, you know, switching from the computers that, you know, people use to create the ads to like, well, we were inventing banner ads. We were
Right.
figuring out how to track them. That was an
Wow.
entirely new line of business, as it were.
Wow.
And so chief technology officer for a time became the hot new, you know, the hot
C-suite
new
job.
title because it was related to revenue and not cost. So
Got it.
CIOs typically had been related to, well, this is the cost of doing
It's an
business.
investment, right?
Whereas CTO was very much, quite often, given revenue targets. And so that's very, very different. And then, you know, fast forward, I became one of the first chief AI officers,
Right.
you know, and that was yet another, you know, new invention
Yeah.
to go with the times.
Thank you for that history. I wouldn't have known it otherwise. I'm grateful to have heard it, and it makes a lot of sense. It's funny. We had a range of different guests on the show, obviously, who have a whole bunch of different expertise. And one of the people on the show rather, is a longtime media executive, and they were talking about how the television production industry changed so much, particularly when the size of TVs changed, right? Because it became a much more visual platform. Of course, it's confusing for me to hear that because I'm thinking TV is always a visual platform, right? But when the shape changed such, right,
Yeah.
the actual pictures you were showing changed with it, and the way they produce things changed. It sounds very analogous, of course, to what you're describing in terms of the role of a CIO turned CTO in terms of the way the internet changed and then changed the work that needed to be done to support that.
Absolutely. I mean, when I was at Cray, one of the things that we did was I did probably one of the very first computer animations. It was for a consumer company. And I remember, you know, people looking at it because it was sort of like slow. I was showing this
Right.
animation on like a little Mac, 128K Mac, and they were like, you know, people are never going to watch TV on those. This is a TV and this is a
This is the
computer.
computer.
And like, you're crazy. No one's ever going to watch TV on a computer. Ha ha ha.
Fast forward, right? Oh my gosh. And Netflix is a comment about that. That's so cool. And so, of course, given the history of the CTO role that you've played many times, I would love to spend some time talking about your time in that role in the city of New York, as CTO, the first CTO of the city of New York. And I understand that when you got the call from, at the time, Mayor de Blasio, you were not even in the country, you were gone somewhere, and you were like, what, really, me, this role? How did it feel to be tapped for a new role in a city as prominent and as complicated as New York?
It was. You're right about that story. It's actually even a little bit funnier in a way because I had been a chief technology officer at a major bank, and then was assigned for 2 years to run Asia Pac out of Hong Kong.
Okay.
And I'd come back for a brief visit, gave a speech here in New York, and then went back to Hong Kong in July of 2014, and I got an email that said, you know, we represent the steering committee. We'd like you, we're interested in talking with you about the CTO of New York. And I literally did a double take. I thought it was fake, actually, because I grew up in New York. There's no CTO of New York. But I looked and I saw that the email address said .gov, and the meeting was in City Hall. And I was like, well, there's only one City Hall, I think. And so it turned out to be real.
Wow.
And, it came at just the right time. I think one of the things that propelled me into that role, and I did have other opportunities just to continue in the CTO role or, be a partner in a big firm. I had already been in finance for almost 2 decades, and I had, patents and, done a lot of innovative stuff in financial services across a wide variety of businesses there. But what struck me was twofold. One, it was the first, and I love being the first at stuff, and it was like a dot that wasn't there, and I was going to define that dot.
Right.
And second, to be honest, it was so important to me personally that the first one should be an immigrant girl from Queens who went to all New York City public schools. And I was being given the opportunity to take all of the knowledge and skills that I'd used, up until that point, and then use them for the good of the city. And, I knew the power of technology to improve people's lives, and this was a chance to do it in the public sector and to do it in a historic way. And so once again, people said, don't do it, and I did it. So it was great. We got so much done. I can tell you a little bit about some of the things that we did there, because it really was informed, again, by my humanistic approach. I'd already been talking about what is a humanistic approach to technology, what is the impact of technology on society and how we think of ourselves and how we interact with each other. By that point, I'd been through advertising, mobile, finance, social media, all of those firsts of those things. And I could see that we could have a positive impact on the lives of everyday New Yorkers. And so in just 2 years, we were able to do Computer Science for All, which was an initiative, a public-private initiative, to have computer science classes in every New York City public school, which has 1 million kids.
Sure.
And 25% of which live below the poverty line. And it was so important to me that they would have access to computer education and the great careers that I had had, and give them a running start. Another one.
Let's pause there for a second. That's super exciting and a really innovative, I think, intervention. And it seems to me, just to sort of connect the dots, which is, I think, is the theme of our conversation, that was in your mind, in part because of your unique experience, having been a public school student in New York City, an immigrant woman at the time. And I could imagine that you would have rolled over in your grave, so to speak, had you been in that role and not thought about it as an opportunity to create more access for folks, not only in their immediate circumstance, right, but access in ways that prepared them for careers and jobs in technology or sort of high knowledge sort of sector jobs, right, that otherwise they might not have been able to access. Yeah. It's an incredible, I'm highlighting it because the way we've talked about CTO, at least in the not governmental public space, has been described in ways of revenue, cost, or sort of for the business model, right? Government does have a business model, obviously, but it's different in thinking about it in a company per se, right? And so it seems like it was not just altruistic, but creative to think about this as an opportunity in the role. That's just so incredible.
Yeah, well, let's drill down on that, because I think that's an excellent point you make. And it wasn't like, some altruistic do it out of,
right.
Of course, that was great, but it was driven by a couple of strategic economic goals. One, New York City was far behind Silicon Valley, where I had started my company, in terms of, entrepreneurial investments, VC money, new companies being founded. The economy was shifting to a technology-driven economy, but, we were afar at the time second to Silicon Valley, which I had experienced in. And I said, well, one of the things, that we talked about in the economic development group was, well, we need the talent here, right? And so we want to grow that talent. Yeah. And how do we grow that talent? Well, it starts young, right? Yeah. And there were many other initiatives around this economic driver, certainly in partnering with private sector and VCs and creating, new spaces and incubator spaces. And we had big app contests and all that had been going on. Right. And in fact, people have been talking about this computer science, initiative, and there were already some after-school programs that kind of helped with that. But to have a large-scale, city-driven one required, some pretty bullish, sort of championing across many departments. I mean, so that's what I think. It was part of the business model to
I was going to say it
we
is
want
actually,
more kids from all over the boroughs to come and learn and help the economy grow for New York City.
Yeah, so it's 100%, that makes perfect sense. And I would say, given our other paradigm of cost and revenue, if you will, it seems like that would have been in the cost line at the time, right? Of course, in the spirit of future revenues, of course, for the city by way of
Right.
attracting investment and all
It
those
was
kinds
an
of things.
investment, not a cost.
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. It's so interesting, and I'm just curious, both in this particular example of the Computer Science for All initiative, but then also broadly in the CTO role. What were some of the roadblocks? And I'm going to overlay that with a question that's related, which is sort of how did you in your role work to create cultures of technology or pro-technology cultures in offices, communities, among individuals for whom that was not their natural orientation?
Yeah, yeah. I think, we did a few things to sort of promote a more innovative approach to government. That entrepreneurial feeling. I did a long listening tour. I mean, New York City, even then, was big, and it now is even bigger. 325,000 employees, over 90 billion in an annual budget. 50 agencies, a dozen or so governor's offices, and one CTO, right? And so I was pretty strategic about it in that I talked to a lot of folks and then realized that there were pockets of innovation across different agencies, but they
Right.
weren't
They
necessarily
integrated.
sharing them with each other. So I helped to convene, regular meetings across agency meetings that allowed people to share their innovations across different agencies. It was a format that I kind of borrowed from Pecha Kucha, which was, every agency got 10 minutes to talk about their latest and greatest thing. And then within an hour, because people are very time strapped,
Right.
you could listen to 5 different presentations, and they have
Right.
one every month. And that just created so much more of a sharing environment, looking across, oh, you're doing Agile and you're doing a big database, you're doing this and that. And that really helped. Another one we did was we created a guide for how to do hackathons in government. What's the,
Okay.
because everybody was talking about hackathons, but within government, how do you do that? How do you engage communities as part of like problem solving with the government and like give out prizes? And then each agency started to have their own hackathons, So that was one of the major things. And then, I would say highlighting and shining a light on agencies that really were being innovative and kind of a reward system for that. I think there wasn't a mechanism for doing
Incentivizing,
great things or
promoting, yeah.
incentivizing it and saying, well, it's a largely thankless job, right? So, you want to find ways to give thanks.
Yeah, that's so interesting and so helpful. As you've been talking, I've been curious, and I'm sure you have robust thoughts on this, but I just want to bring them out in this conversation. Sort of how you dealt with the tension of creating more technologically, aligned innovations in terms of government and city life in the CTO role for the city of New York. How you sort of balance the tension between doing that and at the same time not sort of exacerbating or amplifying existing inequities in terms of access to education, technology, things like that. One could imagine when you hear that there's like a new tech thing coming to the city, right? That it sounds exciting for some, for whom they have the ability to sort of understand that, be fluent in that language, sort of be excited about uptaking those new sorts of modalities of living and working. And then there's others who you imagine are like, oh my goodness, like I already don't have a laptop or a thing at home or this or that, whatever, right? Am I going to be left behind as the city becomes more smart or more plugged in or whatever, right? So how did you balance those tensions in your role?
Now, that's another excellent question, because I think what I can say as a private sector person who went into public sector, and that was pretty rare then, maybe less rare now,
Sure.
but it is like opposite world. This is what I tell them. Like, they're like, oh, I'm thinking of doing public sector too. I'm like, okay, it's opposite
Just no,
world.
right.
I'm not discouraging you,
Right.
but the way things work in a revenue-driven, private sector role, efficiency-driven role is not, it's not completely opposite, but almost the opposite of how you think about public sector problem solving, and you need to be willing to do that. Now, I did a couple things that were super helpful. One, I made sure that I had experienced government people around me, policy people, folks, because I knew, okay, I may be an expert in AI and you know, data and stuff,
Sure.
but I wanted to make sure that I could be effective, and so pulled a multidisciplinary team around me, not only of like great techies, but people who've been in government a long time, people who were new to government also, and people who were sort of in between. And so a lot of the tensions are precisely what you just, you know, alluded to. I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Link NYC, which actually was a previous project from the Bloomberg administration, but it was sort of halfway done. It wasn't complete, and then they changed mayors, right? So, so they said, "Hey, you got 3 months. You know, the concessions for payphones expires, but we've kind of got, you know, top 2 hits. So literally, to do something at that scale in 3 months was, you know, impossible.
Right.
But because I didn't know any better, I was like, okay, let me give it a try." And, you know, it was fantastic. First of all, it was an understanding that when you put when you put devices out on a city street, that's everyone. That affects everyone. There's many considerations that you wouldn't think about if you were putting, you know, a Wi-Fi up in a mall even, right? It's not the same thing. And the process for selection, the procurement, the design, and then where I was able to contribute was I took a lot of my own experience in both security policy and privacy policy and applied it to a public infrastructure, which at the time, you know, a lot of public infrastructure wasn't very locked down.
Right.
It wasn't thought of as a potential cyber target back in 2015, 2014, but it is.
Sure.
And so at that time, you know, so it was a great combination between really understanding the multi-agencies, figuring out how to get, you know, replace the payphones with these, you know, free Wi-Fi kiosks, how it was going to get paid for with advertising, how are we going to protect privacy, how are we going to design it so it's wheelchair accessible and can be used by anyone with or without a phone, and all of these amazing things. And it was such an incredible experience to
like it.
really put that out there. And, you know, we didn't know a lot, right? We didn't always predict what things would happen, how people would use them. But we built in some fail-safe. So one of the first things that people started to complain about, because New Yorkers love to complain, even if it's great, we'll complain about it. So, you know, we went in and said, well, we need to be able to centrally control it, but it can't be controlled, you know, or hacked individually.
Got it.
Like you can't just hack into one and then get into all the others, right?
Right.
And so that was good, because one of the first things people did with the tablets was to blast music and have like really loud dance parties on the street, which, you know, we didn't say you can't do that.
Right.
But,
It was the intended use, but there was nothing precluding it.
But it did, you know, so we were able to control that and say, okay, after a certain time of night,
Right.
you
won't be
know,
able to
the
do that.
volume will be off and you have to use a headset. So that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You know, and a lot of people were, you know, pretty concerned about them being, you know, gathering spots and, you know, stuff like that. But, you know, over time, it's now just another part of the street, and people use it to register to vote. People do find information on it. I love walking past a Link NYC and seeing people actually using it, charging their phone, or tourists finding their way on it. And, you know, I think the answer there was, yeah, you don't know everything. And especially if you're a private sector person, just be prepared for it to have a lot more requirements, a lot more consideration for public impact. And, you know, one of the things that we learned from that was, yes, we wanted to put it in areas first that did not have access to the internet.
The Wi-Fi, right.
But unfortunately, the physics was such that we had to start at the main trunk and go out. That's how you build. We
Yeah.
couldn't start. It was just, and that was something that I think we communicated over and over again. It wasn't just that we're starting, the main lines come into for the internet come into New York through Manhattan. So we
Right.
just had to then expand it. It's just it's like how trees grow. Say
Right.
start the tree at a leaf and then come in. Like
Right.
and so, that was something that I might have done a little more communication around.
Sure.
Because we absolutely looked at equity. And then what we did with Computer Science for All, because we had that capability, we discovered that not all schools had internet. So we started with the
with
schools
those.
that could get internet for the first time and then put the programs there first. So whenever you can, absolutely start where you can have the highest impact.
Yeah, that's incredible. This next question might be, it might be fun, might be interesting, I don't know. But I'm just curious because you've served in this role as a CTO in a place like New York, which of course is a large state. It's the largest state in America. It's a very sort of, generally speaking, tech-connected kind of city, right? And I'm just wondering, while in that role and since being in that role, what your thoughts have been about sort of the urban-rural digital divide, right? Because one might argue that actually a place like New York is the last place that needs a CTO, right? Because they're already sort of leaps and bounds in terms of whatever it is, broadband connectivity, other tech sort of literacy and penetration, that you don't need that in New York. They already have a lot of stuff, right? And somewhere elsewhere, maybe in the middle of the country, other rural places, even in New York State, might need sort of a county or regional CTO to try to sort of bring technology to those places. So what has been sort of either the feedback or the thoughts or the thinking around how, technology can bridge gaps between rural and urban areas and create opportunities in rural areas with technology where it doesn't currently exist, if you will?
Yeah, I think, one, I would say that in 2014, New York City was very technologically backwards, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, I had spent 2 years
Yeah, you were in Hong
Hong
Kong.
Kong, where everything was on, running super fast, and the trains were all, on a single card where I could use at 7-Eleven and use in there.
And your ID.
And
I
your
used to have one.
ID, and I was, using fingerprint instead of a passport to get in and out across the border. I was just like, and then I came back to New York, and I was like, huh, and I understood. And one of the things I said when I took the job, I said, we are going to get an award for Smart City before I leave here. And we did. In 2 years, we
Congratulations.
won Best Smart City in 2016 from the Smart City World Congress and Expo. And, and I would agree. I think it is a different set of issues. It makes me happy to hear that who knows if we even need a CTO anymore. But at the time, the reason that role was, this may be an apocryphal tale, but someone who from the steering committee told me that the reason they thought of a CTO was because they saw an ad in the paper for a job in the city called typewriter repair. And it was 2014. And they're like, oh, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
And there were, when I joined the city, still agencies that did not have computers. They
Right.
were still typing things out.
Oh my goodness.
And didn't have internet. And so consider that in 2014.
Right.
And so you can rapidly make change. And I think that divide was, we were at the point at which that divide was going to be perpetuated even further.
Yeah, you didn't intervene at that moment in time.
And so all those things, the connectivity, that requires a person
Yeah.
who will make sure that the intent to make sure that happens. And I think in terms of the rural-urban divide, absolutely, broadband connectivity is still the number one most important thing, along with electricity, water, mobile towers and everything else, because that is how you can erase the borders between rural and urban, and how, things that were so much accelerated during the pandemic was this ability to remote work and
Right.
and everything else and connect people, which has positive and negative impact.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. I think, once New York City had a CTO, other cities looked
I was going to
into
ask you,
it.
yeah. It sounds incredible. It's funny, when we were thinking about, when you said earlier that the computer science for all course was really a workforce investment, one way to frame it would be workforce investment. It reminded me of some work I had done actually outside of Vassar with a group called the American Connection Corps. I'm not sure if you've heard of them before, but it's a AmeriCorps program,
wow.
but funded or organized in part by Land O'Lakes, I think John Deere, and Microsoft,
wow.
with the spirit of trying to invest in AmeriCorps members, particularly in rural areas, to focus their work on helping to bring or create sort of digital interventions or find sort of receptors, organizations, schools, whatever, that could be sort of the hubs for new sorts of technology or other kinds of digital innovations in those otherwise rural places. And so I just want to amplify them as an organization. I think it's trying to work really hard to do the same kind of workforce investment you all did in New York City, but broadly across the country and other kinds of places. So hopefully that work continues and hopefully it goes really well. But I think it's probably modeled in part after the work that you all did in New York or other places in terms of really making the workforce investment around technology a critical piece of the strategy.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's
There
so
are at
cool.
least 1 million unfilled technology jobs today, and this is a matter of economic competitiveness for the United States broadly.
Yeah.
One of my recommendations when at the federal government level, they were thinking, what should we do from the perspective of AI?
Mm-hmm.
And one of my answers was twofold. One, we need to invest as a government in AI research. We need to do some of it ourselves. We can't just depend on private companies that may or may not be owned by U.S. people.
Right.
Second, we need to invest in education. And yes, it's a workforce thing, but yes, it's also just why wouldn't you give people who are here in the United States the opportunity to participate as part of this incredible economic engine for the country? So, investing in AI and digital infrastructure is just smart.
It's critical. So let's pivot there for sort of the last part of our conversation. Let's talk about AI for a little bit. Of course, it's in the news now more than it seems it ever has, although you were starting an AI company back in '85, so maybe we're all just catching up. But I think AI, as you can imagine, as you know better than I, comes with lots of things. It comes with skepticism, it comes with excitement, it comes with ignorance, all the range of things it comes with. And so we've talked about CIOs, CTOs, and you alluded to earlier your role as a chief AI officer. And so I just want to sort of stay there for a moment and sort of hear from your perspective what that job title and description means and the role that job has in our current ecology.
Well, it's funny because like other roles, they may or may not continue to exist after a period of time. It's sort of like now you don't need a separate e-commerce person. E-commerce is commerce. It's the business. And so, you didn't need to have, I have a bank and an e-bank. It's like now it's just banking, right? So at a certain point, these will become embedded into everything we do. But in particular with AI, I think the three components of a chief AI officer are even more needed now. One is, of course, the technical side of it. All of the new capabilities, the infrastructure. But the second is really around compliance and regulatory. So there's sort of a part of this which is sort of the legal aspects, and maybe you partner with your legal counsel, but you need to know enough about that. And then the third component I think is really the business society community component, which is really, okay, what are you optimizing for? You know, sometimes efficiency isn't the goal,
Right.
right? Sometimes it's like good outcomes. And so having someone who has that frame of thinking around what are the actual impacts of what your project is doing, what your AI is doing, is very different than the person in sales or the person in marketing or even the person in the legal department or the technology person. It's who's pulling it all together, who's connecting those dots and saying, what is this going to mean for, you know, the company, the government, the society as a whole? And, you know, we can maybe put that kind of thinking up front instead of cleaning up, unintended consequences later.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful. And of course, as we said multiple times, you've been at quote unquote AI since '85 at the latest. And I think many of us in the country or in the world probably have become somewhat familiar in the last 4 or 5 years, right? And so I'm just curious, given your sort of 2-decade head start, if you will, on the common population relative to AI, what are some things you think people should know or think about or should be disabused of as they try to become more comfortable and fluent with AI in all aspects of their lives?
Yeah. Well, you know, if you look at the coverage from the last few years, either AI is going to save humanity or it's going to kill us all. The answer is somewhere in between. The single most important message that I've been trying to convey is the answer is it's up to us. It's the humans that drive its effect. We're not passively listening to robots who are going to, kill us. We're the ones creating these robots. So we are the ones who can decide. And what was interesting in my time in research and when I was the chief AI officer was my question was, how can I use these technologies and techniques to help the people that need it most? And we were looking at public health, public mental health, what data is available there. How can we get services to people who might need it most? So instead of using the technology to predict when you should, resubscribe to order that next, roll of paper, right? Can we use the same data and technologies not only to deliver services to people who we can say will need it more, but also how do we use that technology to kind of de-bias that data? So there was a whole other area of research, which was how can we actually measure whether the data we've been collecting so far is biased, and is that the right basis to start making decisions going forward?
Absolutely.
And so that was even yet another project. And so, that clearly demonstrates that the technology is not something that we don't control. In fact, we can decide what it does for us and what we optimize for. So do we optimize for revenue or do we optimize for fairness? Right? Do we optimize for efficiency and reduced cost? Or do we optimize for outcomes? Right? In healthcare, that's a very clear distinction.
Absolutely.
Right?
Or I think something that might be even more abstract or more gray is do you optimize for, sense of community, right?
Exactly.
Which I think it's the common criticism or the common question people have, right? I think is what risk does AI present in terms of creating efficiencies or revenue or whatever else it is at the cost of people feeling more alienated or whatever else, right?
That's right.
So I think there's all kinds of, to your point, relevant questions and salt lines that we can think about with AI. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could sort of conclude with one quick,
Please.
sort of story about, this is another philosophical about comportment, right? Which is what is our approach to technology. In the early days of a product called MapQuest, you used to, people didn't want to ask directions, so you would go to this website, it would map it for you, you would print it, then you would bring it in your car with you and follow the directions, right? This was early days. And even in those very early days of MapQuest, people were ignoring what they saw with their eyes, or even maybe what they thought was the right way.
What made sense,
and
right.
then would just like make a turn right into the river or right into a ditch.
Right.
And, And so even when it was just a piece of paper in your car, people were kind of
Or
ceding agency,
deferring to, yes.
deferring to and giving agency to the machine, right?
Yeah.
And with disastrous results. And I worry that now it's so much easier to cede your agency to
Yeah.
a machine that, here's where this is, the underlying message, right? Which is that humans are the drivers. We need to remain the drivers. We have to keep humans in the loop because sometimes the computers are wrong. We have to maintain our own agency.
Absolutely.
And so, I think increasing AI literacy and teaching human agency is going to be a really, really key component for this generation of AI natives.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And it's funny to hear you say that. Just in October, we had a meeting here on campus, and we invited two guest speakers, Anish Rahman, who is the Chief Economic Opportunity Officer at LinkedIn, and his colleague Maria Flynn, who leads Jobs for the Future, a nonprofit workforce development organization. And we brought them because they published a joint op-ed in the Times about a year ago, and it was, we didn't seed this, we just sort of received it, but it was an op-ed about why a liberal arts education is increasingly important in a world full of AI natives and other things like that. And so it was an incredible promotion, but I think really thoughtful piece about, to your very point, why creating more humanistically oriented individuals and individuals who can think across all kinds of boundaries, bring boundaries together, create their own salt lines, are what's critical as we go into a world that's increasingly dominated by or influenced by AI. And so I think we're all singing the same song on the same rhythm, on the same beat. And I hope that we can just stay true to our intentions as we continue to progress through this world. So this has been fun. Before you leave, we have 3 hot seat questions from our students. So the first question is, what is the worst piece of career advice you ever received?
Worst piece of career advice. That's interesting because I've generally received pretty good advice, but I'd say, all the folks who told me not to take a government job after a successful career in finance, almost all but one person thought it was the worst idea they'd ever heard, that I would be disappointed, that I would be frustrated, and and so luckily I ignored it.
Yeah, perfect. Second question, what is your favorite company that you either founded or invested in?
Well, I have to say, after my first startup, and then I had a second startup, which was an internet agency, I got the opportunity to build a bank from scratch. And nobody does that. I just left City Hall. It's kind of hard. How do you follow up being the first CTO of the largest city in the country? Maybe start a bank, I guess. And so, so we started that. And again, in homage to Vassar, I did originally want to name the bank Grace Hopper Bank, but I thought I probably wouldn't get clearance for that. So the bank is called Grasshopper Bank.
Wonderful. There's still a hopper in there somewhere.
Yes, Grasshopper. It's a bank for startups and VCs. It's the Innovation Ecosystem Bank. It's doing very, very well.
Incredible.
We launched in 2019. I remain an investor and shareholder in it. But that is yet another Vassar connection.
Love it. Wonderful. And the last question is, what about the current technology landscape ecosystem scares you?
I think that we, one of the things I didn't appreciate a lot before I got into government was truly the role of regulation, protecting consumers and protecting, the average, person. And, while it's often stated that, policies and regulations can, impede innovation, and I'm a total pro innovation, but it's sort of the idea that, well, it's not innovation if it's just incorrect. It's not innovation if it kills people, and so I think that you could argue that we need a better balance between innovation and, protection of people's privacy and people's, security in particular. But what worries me is that, we may lose sight of the importance of understanding the human impacts of what we do with technology, and that's why we need
more
the
humanists.
the humanists to come out of the machine. Yes.
Understood. Minerva, it's been such a privilege to chat with you today, and I'm so excited for those who are on the other end of the AirPods or whatever other kind of listening device to hear your conversation, to hear your insights. And I'm happy to hear that someone like you, with your values, morals, and experience, have served in the role that you have, that have inspired others to serve in similar roles. So thank you for being here today.
Great. Thank you, Wes, for a wonderful session. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Conversations at the Salt Line. We'll see you next time. Have a good one.